delighted to be here with you at PauseFest, and certainly very grateful to all of you who've stayed into your evening on a Friday. I hope that, and Dirk was a little bit concerned about boring people at 6:30 in the evening. I hope that we're not going to do that. So we're here today not to talk about how big businesses can become like startups. It's sort of well known to everyone in this room that we're living in an age of incredible disruption. And what that's doing is fundamentally changing the corporate models that exist. And to really attack that in a visionary way, we need to, as a business, and for businesses in Australia, we need to deliberately reinvent ourselves. And we're seeing, to Dirk, in Dirk's conversation, it's very clear that there are big Australian businesses already doing this. But we really want visionary companies to reinvent the models that they have, to come up with new products and ideas and really find ways to make themselves fit for the future. So we're here to talk about how those organizations can start up their businesses and their brands. Now, to set the scene, it's well known now that we're in the middle of the fourth industrial revolution. And that's something that's bringing tremendous change. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble with this. The fourth industrial revolution is bringing tremendous change, and that's incredibly huge. And it's unprecedented both in terms of the scope and scale and the velocity at which that change is happening. Now, what that's all about is about convergence. So it brings together and starts to fuse the physical, the digital, and the biological worlds. And with that comes an unprecedented level of connectedness between people and data and devices. So I was thinking about this, and one of my favorite authors, William Gibson, in the late 90s, said that the future is here already, it's just not evenly distributed. And I think we can say now that that's no longer true. So we're witnessing a massive democratization of access to people and data and power and wealth and products and services. And that's not in Australia alone, it's global. And we see that through the work we do regionally, whether it's with the next billion people in India or with hundreds of millions of people across China, Malaysia, Indonesia. And it's really impacting all economies, all industries, and all businesses. So, thank you. That's very helpful. Technology still lets us down these days. So, thinking about the pace of the change that's happening, what that means is that the businesses that don't respond to change are going to be left behind. And I wanted to contrast two different stories. So the first is about a big business that failed to make the change and got left behind. The second is about two tech giants who are really changing how the world works. So let's start with the first one. I think everyone in this room is probably familiar with the Blockbusters versus Netflix saga. Now, Blockbusters didn't see what was coming to them. They were fearing cannibalizing their own business, and at the time, acting seemed sort of something that was just too risky, and the change to them really felt incomprehensible. And so this sort of fairly infamous quote from Jim Keyes, who was CEO of the business, was 2 years before Netflix all but destroyed them. Now, contrast this with the story of Facebook and Google. This is a recent challenge that got quite public attention. So it's a well-known AI challenge to solve the problem of getting a computer to beat a human at the ancient game of Go. It's a Chinese game which involves incredible intricacy and intuitive thought and lateral logic to actually solve. And it was believed to be something like a decade away from being solved. Now, Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, roughly the end of January, went online to say that the Facebook team were just about to solve this challenge. 10 hours later, Google's DeepMind team went public to say that they've just done it. Now, why is that relevant? It's looking at companies and the tech giants like Facebook and Google, a whole new breed of big business. And really what sets them apart is that they are responsive and that they're adaptive and they're quite willing to invest in their future. So, where does that leave big business? The reality is actually quite scary. Corporations, which used to be things that we thought of as enduring institutions, are no longer so. And despite something like $1.6 trillion being spent globally every year on R&D, those businesses are disappearing faster than ever before. Now, we read recently in the Harvard Business Review that publicly listed companies, 1 in 3 of them is going to disappear in the next 5 years. Now, what's staggering about that is that it's 6 times higher than it was 40 years ago. And what's driving that is a range of things: bankruptcies, M&As, liquidations, and that's all being driven by the disruption. So, why is it that despite businesses having tremendous assets and incredible brands, which we're going to hear a bit more about, and clearly it's not all businesses, we've just heard amazing stories about what Australia Post is doing themselves, but why is it that big businesses are still finding it hard to respond to the change at hand? And we certainly see a number of things that drive this and a number of significantly unfair disadvantages that these businesses have. So, firstly, they value short-term incentives over long-term growth. Now, Andy Penn, Telstra CEO, was writing in the AFR yesterday just about this topic. So, where businesses might even want to drive innovation, they get incredible pressure from fund managers, from shareholders, that ultimately leave them focusing on the short-term gains and disincentivize investing for long-term growth. And this creates quite risk-averse and failure-intolerant cultures. If you think of the complex and very costly funding cycles, and I don't know if there's anyone in the room who's ever tried to work on and get a business case across the line in a big corporate environment. It takes a lot of people a very long time and often doesn't focus on the value outcomes that it purports it's going to deliver. They also take a lot of very siloed approaches to building new products and platforms. So you have different departments, each doing their own things. And what happens in that environment is that the focus is very much on driving milestones. So I will deliver at this time, rather than driving for customer value results. And it's not helped because the environments can be complicated and they're often quite politically charged. And what that means is that decisions get delayed more than they are made. And so where does this leave things? Well, it means that a lot of the focus is often on quite incremental innovation and doesn't lead to the game-changing disruptions that are possible and the opportunities that are out there. And these incremental changes happen with long multi-year development timelines, and the products and services that they create can often be made irrelevant by the time they get to market. So it's not entirely that businesses don't get that, and clearly there have been people around in the last few days who very, very much do get it and understand that there's a rapidly changing context and that the scope and scale of the challenge is something that can be addressed. And we're very fortunate in the work that we do to help incubate, launch, and scale new ventures with corporate partners. We're seeing increasingly more people in business and more leaders actually stepping up to this challenge. So what is the first response when they realize the sort of nature of this change?
Thanks. So I think we've got a bit of a problem with our slides. Our visual designer, it's a good job she's not here, she's probably having a heart attack about now. The oh shit moment. We've all had it, mostly in our lives. It basically precedes something that's pretty negative and pretty bad. Actually, most of my best clients have had a big oh shit moment. And that's where the opportunity the context, then all the barriers converge, and they realize exactly the position that they're in. But it's not so bad. The real problem is if the change is superficial. If it's surface deep, and you use words but you don't actually elicit change, well, the response really does need to be different to that. Simply doing more of what you're doing now and doing it better really doesn't help big businesses. Basically what they'll do is end up facing all the barriers that Vanessa's just described. But it's not all bad, because we have Chuck Norris. It's not all doom and gloom. As well as unfair disadvantages, big businesses, and Dirk, wherever he's gone now, was talking a little bit about this earlier, have actually got a massive set of unfair advantages that most startups would absolutely kill for. So to start with, they've got a huge customer base that's often loyal, that they've got access to. They've also got an established brand that they can use to take new offers, new services, new ideas to market in a really effective way. They've got funds and assets that most startups, and I've worked in startups, we would absolutely kill for the funds and assets that most big businesses have got. The other thing they've got is infrastructure and licenses, and this really should not be underestimated. Although digital has democratized access to being a brand new startup and a brand new business, getting access to things like a payments license or a banking license or the infrastructure to support those things, especially in Australia and even in some emerging markets, is nigh on impossible for startups. What it means, though, is that organizations have got to start using these assets in really new ways and different ways. So I couldn't stand up here as part of Boston Consulting Group without using a 2x2 matrix. So it's actually part of the training we're given. Abraham Lincoln, I think, was credited with saying that the best way to control your future is actually to create it. Well, the best way to create something is to innovate. Now, the problem is that most organizations, especially big ones, get stuck with innovation. They start thinking about design thinking, or they start thinking about a technology solution. And actually what they should be doing is thinking about a whole portfolio. Now, the matrix up here actually talks about different types of innovation, and they vary in terms of how far away they take an organization from its core purpose, its core assets, or its core infrastructures. So re-engineering. If I look around me, just at the tags on top of the big buildings here in Melbourne, most of those businesses I've done some work for at some point, and almost all of them have got a customer experience department, a user experience department, a human-centered design department. And they're pushing and they're doing great work in the re-engineering space. They're making what they have today better for a digital world. If we think about reimagining, some of those businesses are taking the next step. They're thinking about new revenue streams. They're thinking about new things that they can do, which are still quite aligned to their core, but making use of those assets and doing them in still a very human or customer-centered way. We think about digital attackers. There's not so many of these around, but they're getting more common. These are large organizations who are deliberately thinking about how to disrupt themselves. They're deliberately thinking about what's going to happen to their core and how they can change that. And they want to do it because they want to be the first, or they want to disrupt their entire market. And finally, new businesses. Large organizations running incubators, large organizations simply running internal venture groups to design new businesses is happening increasingly. So organizations need to think about this as a portfolio, as a spread. Especially big businesses cannot afford to focus on any one of these areas. They must be thinking across all of them. So what's the way of delivering this? Well, apart from having a spread, we need to think about balancing building stuff with investing in stuff. We don't need to build everything. I've got a background in design. I love building stuff and designing stuff, but it's not always the right answer. Businesses need to think about becoming ambidextrous. Companies like Australia Post that Dirk was talking about, they don't change overnight. You don't suddenly go, right guys, we're all arriving at work today, we're going to be agile and innovative. Great, just doesn't happen. So you need to start by being ambidextrous, making space for people not to be confined by the BAU constraints. You need to set up venture teams that are going to be governed like startups and have that startup spirit. And you need to be able to rapidly turn talk, which I hear a lot of, into ideas, into prototypes, and into products that you can then demonstrate success with. To do all of this, you really do need to have the right mindset. So the first thing that you need to do as a business is think like a VC. Now, This is quite challenging for most large businesses. Most of them will have one or two big bets. That might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but they have several big bets. The inclination traditionally is to go and back those big bets as much as possible, to make those big bets work and keep investing and keep pushing and keep making them happen, even actually when they look like they're going to fail. Sorry, excuse me. Actually, quantity is a good thing. Quantity is a good thing across the entire board. If you can quantify what success looks like for all of those different things, and you can stick to those measures. And I mean here both desirability and viability. Planning. If you're thinking about starting new businesses as a large business, then you've got to have a plan to either exit at some point or to bring that back in to actually advance the whole. You also need to think about the portfolio as a whole from a financial perspective. It's no point getting wrapped up in one particular thing. Think about the overall value, and above all else, be willing to kill stuff. If stuff isn't working, if it's failing, get rid of it. It's massive risk to the business. Then you can reinvest that money, those time, those resources, those people, in things which are likely to work. Second thing you need to do is share the love. This isn't necessarily about building traditional partnerships, but you do need to think outside of the organization as a big business. Partnerships should bring new capabilities, they should bring mutual benefit rather than simply being a service provider or a vendor. They need to enable big businesses to start exploring adjacent possibilities, things that people who've worked in a big business and do big business for their thing don't necessarily think about. They need to be able to accelerate innovation, and they need to be able to create new business models, perhaps as an ecosystem play or other model, that are really hard to copy and therefore will be harder to disrupt. And the final thing is being customer obsessed. There's probably not many people in this room who haven't thought in a customer-centered way or a design-orientated way. But this goes beyond customer experience design and human-centered design. It's about making sure we focus on research-based innovation rather than great ideas or expert-led innovation. Things that address pain points, things that address friction, things that may not be obvious. There's not things that customers will tell you about, but things that you can find out about. And having a relentless focus on how the things you're building fit with the market, so product market fit. The also thing is here that innovation doesn't end when you've got something and you've got some stuff. It ends when the customers are happy, and that means launching it, constantly pivoting, constantly iterating, and constantly bringing it back in. And the final thing on the customer-obsessed area is to really be aware that customers have got more choice today than they ever have. And that choice is expanding and expanding and expanding and expanding. And the key to that is making sure that you've got a good brand that's then going to connect your offer back to your customer group and help to expand that.
So where does brand fit in all of this? And I've spent a little bit of time here over the past few days, and it's interesting insofar as brand hasn't come up that much. But if your business is changing, if you're looking at how you're going to deploy tech, if you're looking about how are you going to engage more effectively with customers, then as an asset of the business, well, a brand is an incredibly powerful way in which you go to market. It is, for many businesses, the most powerful conduit between your company and your customers in a way that distinguishes you from the competition. And in the context of this discussion, not much, if anything, of what Vanessa and Craig have shared thus far can really be achieved if you don't have your brand as a conduit working as an effective asset of your business. And certainly, when comparing the effectiveness of big business and the way that it goes to market versus startups, I think there's a lot that we can learn around the flex and agility and adaptability that smaller businesses are building into their brands. And in the good old days, brands look like this. In the good old days of certainty and routine and where you could rely on things being relatively static. But nowadays, you need to be thinking about your brands in ways that allow them to change and evolve and adapt based on individual customer needs or the context or whatever it is that you might need to do in terms of building that broader, more flexible perspective around your business. Whether indeed it's around thinking like a VC, as Craig just mentioned. And for Google, in this example, in the way that they've rebranded, it's much less about the logo and the way in which the logo moves and reshapes itself around all the different parts of their offer. But it's not just big tech companies that are able to do this. It's the IBMs of the world as well. And certainly in the way that IBM now goes to market, who knew B2B could be quite so exciting? And it's not about one logo, let's copy and repeat. It's all about routine and repeating the message ad nauseum. It's very much about how do we find ways in which we can flex our brand to have a far more evocative sense of what our business is about and how we then communicate that. And closer to home, I think Telstra is a great example of a business that spent a lot of time understanding how its brand could wrap itself around all the different things that it does, as opposed to taking a very narrow cast view of how it went to market. And that was one of its shortcomings. They recognized it as a way in which that was an under-leveraged asset of their business if they were going to ensure they had competitive advantage against all the other players in the market, big and small. But more than that, they recognized their brand was not simply about identity, but also utility. So a great example from Telstra is the Snap app, which I think about 50% of their employee population has now downloaded. It's exclusively for employees, so that when they get caught at a barbecue with someone berating them for the service that Telstra offers, which in spite of all their best efforts still happens, they can actually use their brand as a tool to do something about it. Logos aren't that useful. Tools, far more useful. And that's why Google's evolved its brand in the way that it has, why IBM has built that flexibility into its own identity, so it becomes a far more useful tool for how you go to market and enabling not only employees but also customers to use that brand to do the things that they want to do. Now that's far easier, granted, when you're only dealing with a single product, which in the case of most startups, it's single product brand. And it's much easier to do that when you're thinking about a product, an interface, and how we use the brand as the interface to drive the customer experience. And as big business has the scale that it has, it's a natural challenge that it faces. But at the same time, no startup starts up to be small. They want to grow, they want to scale. So they will face no different a challenge as their own business evolves. And I think this is where big can be beautiful. And CommBank is a great example of a business that's really expanded and extended and stretched its brand around everything it does, with a really clear single-minded focus around how it represents its brand and what its brand stands for, but through language, through its people, through its behavior, start to make sure that their brand can wrap itself around its business in a way that does flex and is adaptable as opposed to just repetitious and boring and routine. So a couple of examples to pull out quite specifically. Firstly, Kaching. I can practically guarantee in days gone by that would have been its own logo, all singing, all dancing, completely separate, completely standalone. It has a different perspective based on the language that's built around the name of that application of the brand, but everything else sits very much in a CommBank context. So because they're not relying on the logo, because they're leveraging language, they can build that kind of stretch and extension into their brand and the way in which they go to market. And similarly, they're thinking inside of the business as well. In the example on the right, We Believe We Can is around how you put the brand into the heads, hearts, hands, minds of employees and actually have them deliver that experience operationally. Again, logos aren't particularly useful if you're stood in a branch having a conversation one-on-one. But the brand is a tool. How does it inform my behavior? How does it inform my language? Far more useful and far more effective, and starts to hardwire the kind of flexibility one might need to make for a more dynamic brand in the future. So there's some of the ways in which business changes are informing brand changes, and they very much go hand in hand. And in some respects, it's because of all these changes that we're experiencing that this quote, which is from about 10 years ago now, this quote has never been truer than now. And recognizing this, there is an onus on big business to leverage those assets that give it the potential for competitive advantage. Funds, large customer bases, big brands that are well known, big brands that are so well known most startups would kill for them. And if big business is able to far more effectively leverage those assets, yes, it will take a different approach, it will take a different mindset, it will take a different process for building a brand that can have the flex to wrap itself around an organization and actually make a meaningful way for engaging with its customers. But if big business can do those things, well, then it can start itself up and lead the next wave of innovation through scale and making sure its message gets to its customers. Thank you very much.